Yep, and we are rolling. What is 5G? Where is it? How does it affect me and my family? Are there any studies talking about the health effects of it?
5G is the next generation telecommunications service. There's been 1 to 4G before it. Everything you use today is 4G. 5G is the next generation that almost fundamentally changes how the infrastructure of services change. They're using a combination of various known technologies, stuff that have been around for a long time in the 4G space, and then there's some new stuff in the 5G, particularly those that are the small cell towers that are being in front of your home. So it's a combination of a whole lot of things merging together to provide end-to-end service. It's service that is orders of magnitude more speeds. It allows far more density of use. There's so many benefits that are being established in the industry. The flip side of that, of course, there's not been one study that says the new technologies being delivered are safe. So what we're finding is that when they're using certain aspects of this network, we're going into a new domain. And to answer your question about is it dangerous to your family? No one can tell you that. Why? We have no idea through research or study if it's dangerous or not. If I was to extrapolate, however, I know, for example, that the gut, the microbiome of your gut, when you're exposed to 4G RF signals, it disrupts the gut. And as you may know, the bugs in your gut are 10 times more than cells in your body. So we know for sure immune system potentially can be impacted. We know that antibiotics, you become more resistant when you use 4G. And there is a little bit of research that's coming out around 20 gigahertz. And we know that bugs like it. Is that a problem? Could be. From past history, we know from research and science that it has been up to this point, and we may see that kind of problem get worse. In general, there's been very little study of the higher speeds that's being used in 5G, particularly around the small cell. And that small cell, typically over the next year or so, is going to be around 23 gigahertz to about 60 gigahertz. They use technology in which they take antennas, the phase array of the antennas, and they actually can target a signal directly towards you and your cell phone. In fact, it's going to look for where you are, and it's going to focus on that. When they do, they're using multiple paths of data, MIMO, multiple in, multiple out. That's going to focus into that cell phone, that router, whatever the end point is, and that's twice the number of transmission signals currently today. You have one signal going to you today, and then in 5G cell towers, the small cells, they're going to be 2. Is that going to be a bad situation? I don't know. No one can tell you. But one for things for sure, we should be careful as we move ahead. And you really do need to know that these technologies that are evolving to provide what they're saying is a high demand for bandwidth brings some risk to us, and we really don't know the magnitude of that risk.
Does the United States allow a higher allowable amount of radiation from cell phones than other countries? And if so, why?
It turns out that the strength of the signal, 1.6 watts per kilogram, that the FCC has approved in 1987, is twice, typically, the power levels of signals in Europe. So in Europe, there's there's more concern about the health, and as a result, the standards bodies have reduced these signals to maybe a more acceptable level. The US, however, is the highest of levels.
What would you say to a teenager who speaks on their cell phone 4 or 5 hours a day?
You have troubles because the standards we just spoke about, the FCC standards, were created for a 6-foot male, 6 minutes use, and only the thermal impacts. So the standard basically says your cell phone can heat you up by 2 degrees. And that standard signal for a 6-foot male goes in your head 2 inches. That's what the standard is, and it's thermal. They used military models for that, and that's how they derived the standard. A child, by the way, it represents 3% of the marketplace. That standard was, you're not 6-foot male, you're 5-foot male. Your wife is a 5-foot female. Your children are 4-foot terrors. Everyone has a different impact with that beyond the 6-foot male. If you're a small child, 6 years old, chances are the signal goes completely through your head. If you have a teenager, which was your question, it probably goes through half his head because the density of the skull, the interference from the skin is not sufficient to only allow the signal to go in 2 degrees. So they're using it multiple hours at a time, which the standard didn't reflect. And all science that we see today, all the research that we have, it doesn't look at the thermal. It looks at the biological impacts. Anger of our kids, Alzheimer's, ADHD. These are known, connected kind of conditions that have been linked to cell phone use. And anger with their kids. It's growing. You can see from scientific evidence that we've seen a trend in a lot of the behavioral issues with kids. Some are suggesting there are many environmental conditions outside of the RF signal, but also there are others who are saying, no, there's a direct link to the frontal lobe. And by the way, science now can actually measure the anger when you have a cell phone influence in the brain. So we're beginning to get evidence that it really does affect the behavior, the biological response of the body.
The FCC is the government agency that's supposed to protect the public from any ill effects from wireless radiation or 5G wireless. Why has the FCC been called a captured agency? Who's in charge of the FCC and what's their background? How does the telecom industry influence the FCC to get it to do what it wants? What other conflicts of interest exist within the government, FCC, and the telecom industry?
It's a great question. I actually worked with guys who ended up going to the FCC. They were brilliant engineers. And if you think about what the FCC does, it establishes standards. So you really got to get someone who understands how you establish a standard. And because of my background in the Bell system, I actually had people who understood that. So in general, like many other industries, they go to the facilities, the manufacturing organizations, the service provider organizations, and they look for experts to help populate the right FCC staffing to be able to make intelligent decisions. My friends, the people I worked with, they were engineers. They were electrical engineers. They knew nothing about the biological impacts. And so over these many, many years, we've had what you're referring to as a captive audience populated by those who are within the audience. I'll give you an example. The FCC currently is being, the chairman was the counsel for a very large service provider. He was the counsel. And then before him, there was a chairman who led an organization, a cell phone service provider organization, that was representing those service providers. And he went, a guy, by the way, who his work included looking for links between cancer and use of cell phones. And he had actually evidence 20-some odd years ago that there could have been a potential link. So we know the guy's familiar. We know he was in the business. He was the one who was moved from the CTIA, from, I don't want to say that. He was the one who went from an organization that helped protect the service provider to the FCC. So the previous guy was a core individual in the service providers industry that went to the FCC. And guess what? He was the one who approved 5G. He was the one who said, we really don't need any study. It's too important for us that we get ahead of the world and we introduce 5G. We don't have time to test, to verify that this technology we're introducing will be safe. And so they are a captive audience. But that's true for the smoking industry. That's true for the pharmaceutical industry. You can't have someone looking at if this pill is going to work if they don't understand if the pill is going to work. So unfortunately, the agencies populate with manufacturing participants that have maybe a unique view from their service they've provided previously into the industry. So they're somewhat captive. They seem to represent the service providers more so than they do the users of these services. So that's like what's happening in industries all over. And it's happened here. There's no question about it. The standards we were talking about a moment ago, for example, were made in 1987. In December of last year, the FCC said, we don't need to review the standard created in 1987 because we think we understand it enough. And you got to remember, since 1987, we've gone from 2G to 5G. We've gone to technologies that potentially are fundamentally different. And they do impact. And we have not one researcher, not one medical expert that are on those panels reviewing those standards. And interestingly enough, by the way, with that standard, Kennedy Jr., who represents kids in the market, he's an attorney representing kids for inoculations, he just put a lawsuit against the FCC about their decision not to investigate the fact that it's only thermal that they're worried about. And he said, you should have considered biological. So the FCC is somewhat captive audience, and I think we now see some evidence in the marketplace where the groundswell of concern is beginning to get into the courts.
If you have an EMF meter and it's registering low exposure, does that mean the Wi-Fi in the other room or the cell phone on the counter is not creating any cell phone risk to you?
With RF or ELF emissions, distance is your friend. The fact that it's in the other room, it's still transmitting at the levels they're doing. But when you see the logarithmic function, the power levels going down into the other room, that's a physics observation. That's why when you use technologies like these, when you move it away from your body, like for example, if you have a cell phone to your head and it's hitting your head, that's the worst potential danger to the body. If you take it 1 to 2 feet away, you actually reduce the potential dangers by 80%. If you're 4 foot away, it's over 90%. So when you take something and you move it away from you, you're actually gaining the benefit of distance being your friend. And a meter, you don't even have to use a meter. If you know where that is, relative to where you are, you're safe, so long as you have that distance.
The Cleveland Clinic has been warning its patients for years to keep phones out of their pockets if they want to have healthy babies. And the same advice comes from the Mayo Clinic, and the reason is there's a recognition that cell phone radiation can damage testicular function. Can you explain that in more detail?
I can. The RF signal from a cell phone can do DNA damage to a cell, or it can mutate the cell. And it uses different mechanics than X-rays do. A cell breaks down when there's a signal from a cell phone by actually the cell itself getting fatigued and calcium building up within the cell. And then there's a chemical reaction that occurs. And that chemical reaction is what creates a mutated DNA damaged cell. In fact, Dr. Paul Appel is an industry expert who's been looking at that breakdown. And he has been saying, somewhat to an extreme, when you have a cell phone in your pocket and you're a 12-year-old girl, there could be DNA damaged mutated cells in the egg itself. And subtending generations, 20 years from now, when she has babies, could potentially have that mutation transferred to her subtending generations. So there is a concern that when you have cell phones or laptops close to your groin area, male or female, you are potentially exposing yourself to possible damage which could be serious. If you go to the doctor, you and your wife want kids, having kids. Doctor, I use my cell phone all the time in my pocket, but we don't have kids. The very first thing he says is, where do you keep your cell phone? The reason why is because we know 25% of the male sperm, after 3 or 4 hours of exposure, is immobile. We know that over the last 10 years, 50% of sterility of man is evolved. That's substantial. And there is some evidence that the toxic influence in our environment could be the cell phone in our pocket. And that's why you see the clinics saying, where do you keep your cell phone? I have an interesting story. When I wrote the book Radiation Nation along with my son, and I had Dr. Prasad read the book. He's a brilliant, brilliant man who was probably the very first radiologist in the country. And he read the book and he said, boy, I learned stuff. Even the most brilliant men didn't quite understand fully. And I mentioned in the book, there's a potential danger to the womb of a girl and to the groin of the man. And he said, I don't really believe that can be true. Well, this was a learned man who, from experience, was saying it wouldn't happen. 2 years later, he calls me up and he said, we had a woman that I was consulting on that had a baby that died almost immediately when being born. We found very, very strange mutated cells. And you know, I didn't believe you when you said it's real. But now I'm starting to change my opinion, because this lady had her cell phone and laptop near her womb day and night. By the way, the story turns out good at the end of the day, because she stopped doing that. And she had a healthy baby boy 3 years later. So you really can, through a little bit of caution, deal with those things. And that's why the clinics say what they do.
You mentioned a lack of overall studies, or a lot more have to be done. Have there been studies on the health effects of wireless radiation? And what was the difference in the results between the industry and non-industry funded studies? And what have the most recent large-scale studies on wireless radiation's effect on human health determined? Were the findings widely shared with the public and the media?
It turns out there's a preponderance of research that was privately funded that show clear evidence of linkage, a preponderance. There's no debate in the science world that there's a link between many, many illnesses and problems we have with our body from the research side where there's been unfunded. Not surprising when you look at the funding associated with studies that were funded by the service providers, there's none. This is historic. This is not unique to the industry. My brother took a court to federal court level where there were 10, he was interviewing 10 of the most prominent individuals on L-tryptophan. He's talking to him and he asked him a question, and all of a sudden my brother realized this guy was on the payroll of the manufacturer who was producing the L-tryptophan. Long story short, he won his case because it was clear that that industry was influencing the marketplace through some of the world's experts, and it was in their favor that they were influenced. By the way, in the US, there hasn't been funding for study on RF signals for 30 years. It was all pulled out. It's amazing that where we were the lead in research and science in this space, we have none. So, National Toxicity Program, a division of the federal government, initiated a study 7, 8 years ago. And it was an epidemiology study. And they intended to prove that there was no link. So what they did was they had very, very large populations of exposures, and exposures, totally no exposures to other populations. The importance of it was the populations were large enough where you could draw with statistical significance the results and their validity. In other words, I can say with 95% confidence that the results of this study clearly indicate a condition created in the study. This study with the NTP, the guys who did it, the researchers who did it, they were really, really, really smart because, as I mentioned before, the standards were based on the thermal impact. They moved the transmitters away from the epidemiology groups where thermal was removed. And the only evidence they would have is the biological. So they go $25 million being spent over several years, and the reports come out. There's a significant set of data that says there's frontal lobe cancer or tumor of the frontal lobe and to the heart, which I was actually surprised about. That was one of those things that I'm a subject matter expert to some extent, and I didn't predict that. So here we now have statistically significant data in epidemiology, which is always the leader in science and research, has been since the year of the flood. And there's now evidence that there's direct links. Believe it or not, there was the Ramazzani Institute out of Italy that did the same thing more recently. You know what? They had the same results. They had statistically significant confirmation of the NTP. And it's frontal lobe, and it's the heart. Now, by the way, over the last 10 years, frontal lobe cancer, where the links to cancer are from use of cell phone, have grown 2% every year for 10 years. So the data of the world's use sort of matches what they found. And of course, Cochrane, O.J. Simpson case, frontal lobe cancer. McCain just passed away from cancer from use of cell phone. Biden's son, same difference. So we're seeing more and more evidence of frontal lobe. And by the way, cell phone doesn't affect other parts of the brain. It influences the brain, which is a really problematic in and of itself. But where you look for linkage to cancers, there are direct links in these recent studies.
Does long-term use of cell phones have any impact on memory?
Long-term use of cell phones is sort of an important point. After 10 years of use, it's typically suggested, based on study work we have, that you're 3 more times likely to get serious, if not cancer, of the brain. It multiplies by 3. We know that there are these hard facts about serious problems, and that's certainly important to understand. We also know, when I used to do study work for the Bell system, I used to look for crosstalk. Crosstalk is interference from one system to another. And I used to look at the crosstalk from an electronic device to another electronic device. Well, it turns out a cell phone is an electronic device, and so is your brain. And so there's this crosstalk interference to the frontal lobe for anger, emotions, ADHD, all these kinds of things that we know are growing quickly as problems in our society. And there's more and more growing evidence that the cell phones are potentially leading that, as well as the ambient of the RF from Wi-Fis and laptops influencing the behavior driven by the brain.
What's the health concern if we're upstairs in our house and someone's using their cell phone downstairs?
So when you have multiple cell phones being used and they're in use, they're transmitting omnidirectionally in the room. So when that's occurring and you're upstairs, you have an omnidirectional signal that's being transmitted to you. So there's a very real concern to some extent, but not much, because the distance. You're far enough away from the transmitters that the distance reduces the potential dangers to your body. With 5G, that's different, by the way. Let's say you and I are in a room. Both of us are using our cell phones. With 5G, the signal, they have antenna phase arrays. They're actually focusing the antennas towards you. And by the way, they're focusing towards me. And let's say I'm in direct line to the cell tower between you and the tower. So that direct energy is hitting you, And by the way, going right through me. And then you think about where others are using the cell phone, the 5G cell phone. It is a MIMO, multiple in, multiple out. In other words, you have two signals that are focused on the cell phone, and both of them are going through me. That's how they get the capacity, the ability to move all that content, that bandwidth will be available. They're using MIMO technology, and they're using multiple paths. So in cell phones today, we have one signal hitting our head. Then we have now two with 5G. And the energy power level that is starting, because the signal only goes 850 feet, is now 20 watts at the cell tower, at the small cell tower. On a standard 4G or less, it's 60 watts being transmitted. So all of a sudden, in your front of your house, you've got 20 watts being transmitted, and I'm only 20 feet away, and you're 30 feet away, and I have high concentration of signals now towards my body and yours at twice the power levels, and it's in both directions. So now, not only do I have what historically was 4G exposure, I now have twice that at a higher level with the cell towers.
What do you think about wireless Bluetooth headphones? Are they a health concern or not?
They are a health concern, and let me explain why. When you have we were talking about the FCC standard. It's 1.6 watts per kilogram, right? 1.6 watts. Bluetooth is 0.3 watts. It's an RF signal. It's just less power. If you use Bluetooth earphones, that Bluetooth signal on some, I can't claim all, but on many of the Bluetooth devices, the way you get your stereo is from this one side communicating to the other side. So you have 3 watts, 0.3 watts, being transmitted through your head. You played football. I played football. I got hit in the head. I got concussion. I don't know. You maybe did, maybe you didn't. If you're concussed and your blood-brain barrier is down, 0.1 watts, 15 times less power than a standard cell phone, can mutate a cell in the frontal lobe. So that was a little bit longer description, but there's no question about it. If you have devices that are transmitting through your head, they may present a problem for you long term. If it's for your kids, it's even worse because the signals now is going through a child's head. His whole life, her whole life, they're being exposed to these kinds of things. And me, I'm pretty old. I'm not going to die. I'm going to die much earlier than they. I didn't have cell phones in my environment for the last 10, 15 years. They have their whole life. And when you do these kinds of things, there is a cumulative effects.
Why has the country of Belgium banned the sale of mobile phones designed for young children?
For those very reasons. But there are others too, by the way. There is the emotional tie to devices that is actually growing in the industry. And they're being banned largely because of use. It's like addiction. You know, you got to look and see if your friend sent you a note. You got to check to see if you missed a message. That addiction is pretty severe in time with kids. And so they're really finding that the only way to sort of curtail this kind of trend is by banning it. So I think that's more the driver than the physical potential for biological impacts, but those are subtly involved as well.
A court in Italy ordered the Italian government to publicize cell phone risks. Now in Italy, there are 2 court cases that have concluded that cell phone radiation caused tumors and people have gotten money for their cell phone related tumors. What countries aside from Italy advise and have information about how to reduce exposure to cell phone radiation?
I'm going to talk a little bit about the Italian one first, because it's so important. It turns out you're right. What they brought to court was a cell phone's being used. I got cancer in the frontal lobe, and in the first court case, they won. The service providers came in, and they said, nope, we're going to appeal because it doesn't make sense. We should be winning. The first appeal lost. They lost again. Only recently, literally within the last month, the second appeal was settled. The judge said I couldn't rely on the evidence I was getting from the service providers. They were biased, in my view, and there was no question in my mind the plaintiff was the winner. So the significance of that for us is hopefully a trend. Maybe we're finding out that through the courts there is some danger, and from court actions like that, it becomes common knowledge about the dangers. In fact, it parallels smoking, by the way. When I was 12 years old, I smoked. I wanted to be a big man. That was quite a number of years ago. And at that time, nobody knew that there was direct link to cancer. It wasn't common knowledge. Did you know the researchers knew at that time that there was clear evidence of linkage from smoking and lung cancer? So what did it take for it to become common knowledge? It was courts. The fact that you'll die from smoking cigarettes is on every package was because of the courts. And you know, as a side note, today the cancer over the 30-year period for smoking and links to cancer has dropped by 50%. I don't know, it's half the people are smoking, but the incidence of cancer from smoking has dropped by 50%. But it took the court to make that claim. And by the way, it's also true with Berkeley. In Berkeley, over the past few years, they said, we want a sticker on cell phones that says there may be potentially danger here. There were 3 different court appearances. One, the original court, and then there were 2 appeals. And by the way, it was being appealed by CTIA, which we spoke about before. And turns out they lost in court. So now we have instances where they're beginning to lose in court.
The French did a test of 400 cell phones bought off the shelf. 9 out of 10 cell phones failed to pass the current European standards. Can you explain that in more detail?
I can, actually. From a manufacturer's point of view, it's really hard to be precise in the transmissions. In fact, the cell phone transmissions, as you point out, were far greater than the standards. Some level of that diversion from the standards is acceptable, by the way. And so what was also true about that was that the manufacturers were building transmissions that were not governed not to exceed those levels. So it's true. Same thing in the U.S., by the way. I don't know if you know, in Chicago, there was a local paper there that took a dozen phones. They took them off the shelf, and they found some of those phones to exceed it by multiples. And so that wasn't totally surprising. by the way, the FCC allows a phone to drift by 10 to 15%. So rather than 1.6 watts, it can be 2 watts and still be in the standards. These that they found were higher. The FCC actually responded recently with their own test results. What they did was they went to all the manufacturers and they said, give me one phone. Give me one. Now, they also claim that they went and they bought others, but their test results, where they identified their testing for particularly serial numbers, they only had one. So I used to run testing for all systems. I'm not sure I would have asked the vendor to give me the one that I think represents their product, because there's a potential for that they could be playing with us a bit, and I would have bought them off the shelf randomly. FCC did not do that.
Recent scientific publications have shown that electromagnetic fields affect living organisms at levels well below international and national guidelines, meaning the limits that governments have set. These effects include cancer risk, cellular risk, increase in harmful free radicals, genetic damage, structural and functional changes of the reproductive system, sperm damage, decreased sperm, learning and memory deficits, neurological disorders, and negative impacts on general well-being. I think we've touched on some of these. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I want to reinforce a point. We talk about the cell damage. In the clinics today, they're not seeing excess of cancers in the clinics. They're seeing the emotional changes in the clinics. They're seeing people who have been exposed and having body response that's never been experienced in the clinics. You can have I'll give you an example. You can have a doctor and you can say, I have a headache. And they say, take 2 aspirin. When the real reason you have a headache is because you're sitting next to a router. In fact, what's interesting about that is I had one clinic practicing physician call me. And we were talking, and he was telling me how he has one of his, the people in his office using screens all day, having dry eye. And he said, like, you know, I treat it with drops, and I've been doing this for 10 years, and head redness is temporarily reduced. And I said, why do you think that it's dry eye that's not driven by the job she does? And I said, have you considered shielding the blue light from the screens? And he said no. And so I said, I'm going to send you glasses. Have her wear them and see what happens. Got the glasses. 2 hours later, her eyes were completely clear. 2 hours. And it's been clear ever since. She had this chronic condition for 10 years. It was from the electromagnetic radiation that she was receiving. In other words, as I started answering the question, I'm not worried about the cell breakdown. It's there. There's no question about it. I'm worried about the quality of life it seems to be impacting now, and we're seeing more and more in the clinics.
Is using a cell phone in cars more dangerous than in your house?
The answer is yes, and I'll tell you why. When you use a cell phone in a car and the signal's trying to get out of the car, it's hitting the metal. And that's referred to as a floating ground. So it's hitting the metal, and it can't find the cell tower. It's looking for the cell tower. So what does it do? It modulates up to the maximum level of transmission, and that's how it gets to the distant cell tower. And so what you know when you were in a car the cell phone is modulated to the highest level of power coming out. If you have that cell phone next to your body, 2 inches, 4 inches away, well, let's say 1 inch away, you have it in your pocket. That's the maximum transmitted level because it can't get out of the car. If you're going to use cell phones in a car, take the cell phone, put it to the driver's seat, or from the driver's seat to the passenger side, so you have a little bit of distance. So even though it's modulated at a higher power level, at least you're moving some distance between you two from the power source, and it makes it more safe.
How effective are the different shielding products to protect us from EMFs?
There are a lot of claims made by many companies. And I always suggest to a buyer looking for shielding products that they really need to see independent laboratory study with shops that know what EMF is, so they can independently substantiate the claim. So I really do recommend, if you're looking for a shielding product, find if that device you're buying has been tested by someone outside the company that is educated in how it should be tested to ensure the claims are being made. And what I do know is some may work. I also know some do nothing. It's not even a placebo. So you really need to be careful when you make those choices.
Can you explain the role different government agencies are playing with regard to wireless radiation? Are the FCC or the EPA looking out for our best interests? Do they require any pre or post market tests on cell phone safety?
It turns out that the federal government, as I mentioned before, has no funding for inter-organizational kinds of expert knowledge to be placed on the standards that are occurring in the cell phone industry. It doesn't exist. You would think EPA would be worried about our environment and the impact of a transmitted signal to an impact to the cell, but there is virtually none. The FCC certainly doesn't have any analysis on what the performance from their perspective on the cell phone. In fact, there's really nothing going on at all in the government, except for the NTP I mentioned. But they had no governance responsibility. They just did a test and produced the report. That didn't change any government position on cell phone standards.
If 5G was a big issue, wouldn't the mainstream media be talking more about it?
I would hope they do. And look, if there was some advertising you're going to do as a service provider, you'd be telling everyone about the strengths of the technology, the benefits of the user, the fact that the Internet of Things, that is, your refrigerator can talk to your toaster. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but it's interconnection with the entire infrastructure of modern use of technology. And so everything that's you see in the marketplace is a position by a $17 trillion industry establishing a position of value. That's what they're trying to do. There is a paid view from an industry that can afford it. There are no requirements in the news industry to have a balanced view necessarily. It's just who's the bigger mouth. It turns out the research side of telecommunications, that which is trying to describe the challenges and issues, the health issues that we have, they're not highly funded. They don't have this deep pocket of money to clearly state their position. But they're doing a good job, but they just don't have the horsepower that some of these others have in the marketplace.
Does standing barefoot on the grass around you protect you from wireless radiation?
No, but it's good. It turns out that our body's a capacitor. And when you're exposed to electromagnetic radiation, there's a charge essentially that can occur in the body. When you were a kid, you put your wool socks on, you ran across the rug, and then you touched the doorknob. What happened? You got a shock. That is where your body is accepting that charge. And when you went over there and touched the metal, it discharged. So the body is a capacitor to some extent. So when you have a short to ground, the closest path to the grounding of the earth, it actually does allow whatever capacitance is within the body to drain. And so there is a benefit of that. And that's actually what's happening. It's really true.
How can individual people do something to stop the rollout of 5G in their town, city, or state? What are 4G and 5G streamlining bills?
The federal governance is to some extent a captured audience, to some extent, as we mentioned. I also mentioned before that Kennedy is going after them to some extent. I actually expect more to do that in the future. Local municipalities, based on standards established by the FCC, can say, I don't like the color, I don't like the height. But what they can't do is say, I think it's a health problem. The FCC actually has restricted all local municipalities from denying 5G tower installations, unlike 4G and all the previous technologies. That's never been, it's unprecedented that they do this. And when you think that the local municipalities can be influenced, it really is in conflict with FCC. However, given I said that, the local organizations that want to sort of address this is a potential hazard to them and their families, they can. And if you approach it correctly, you can show that the responsibility of the municipality is to protect your health. They protect you from walls falling on the ground when you're sitting down on the ground. They're responsible. They have a liability responsibility to protect you and in the code enforcement of your standards. So there have been cases in Portland, for example, where a buddy of mine actually went to the municipality and said, your responsibility is to protect my health, my family's health. And they persuaded the local municipalities to deny the deployment of technology in their space in conflict with the FCC. I don't know where that's going to go, but there's groundswell stuff going on, and that's good because it's going to be the groundswell that makes change ultimately at the end of the day.
What's the safest way to speak on a cell phone? Are there any types of hands-free or headphone devices that make it safer?
Yeah, think of it this way. If it's to your head, it's the worst it can be. If you put it in your hand and look speaker, that's better or almost best. If you use a set of earbuds, wired earbuds, that's slightly better because it's now far away and you have nothing coming to your head. The best choice is where you get EMF-free earbuds where they go acoustical, where they take the electronic signal, convert it, and they have a speaker down here where the conversion occurs, and there's a tube that goes to your head. there is literally no emissions coming in. And so there's a variety of different ways to do it. Which one works for you is your choice.
You recently said that 1 in 6 American couples are unable to have a child when they want to, and that last year the birth rate in the United States dropped the most that it ever has in recent history, according to the CDC, 3% in a single year. What does this have to do with wireless radiation?
Yeah, that's where the debate is. And actually, it's not local, it's worldwide. And so when you talk about a cell phone in your pocket, you talk about a laptop on your lap, you talk about the tablet, the iPad you're using right next to your groin, there is a clear path to interfere with the ability to have children. That has become more alarming in recent years. And guess what? Cell phone use, tablets and devices have increased over that same time period. Is that correlation just coincidental, or is it truly cause and effect? You decide.
Is it true that when you have a phone in your pocket, it's like a two-wave microwave radio? Can you explain that?
I'm going to answer that in two ways. You called it a microwave radio. I'm going to call it a microwave. When you have a microwave oven, I don't use one, but if you had one in your kitchen and you put your meat into the microwave and you closed it and you cooked it for a bit, what's going on? It turns out the water between the cells are getting hot and it oscillates the cells, ultimately cooking your food. 2.3 watts, 2.3 gigahertz. Wi-Fi is 2.4 gigahertz. It's the identical frequency. In other words, it is a microwave oven that is known to be a thermal emitting signal that can cook your phone. When I mentioned before about the cell phone to the head, I said 2 degrees. It's a microwave. It's heating up the area of your head, and that's what it is. And so when you put a device like that in your pocket, particularly front pocket, by the way, it is transmitting constantly because there's GPS interconnection, there's pinging that goes on, where are you, where are you today? And so you're getting emissions that are like a radio communication, but for functions of the cell phone. If I put that cell phone, if I put my arm up and I tell you push my arm down and you push it down, you'll find resistance. If I take that cell phone that has that two-way microwave and I put it right next to your heart or my heart and you push my arm down, it'll have less resistance. It's literally interfering with your body function, the control of body function.
Does my local town have the right to say no to 5G, or is it just a national thing?
No, they don't have the right. What the FCC did was they had decreed through law that the local municipality cannot decide that a cell phone tower can or not be installed. They lost that. They're allowed to talk about some aspects of it, but not the health aspects that I mentioned before. So they really have taken out the responsibility of the jurisdiction that the local municipalities have for the growth of their town. That's unprecedented. It's not happened anywhere else.
Should schools ban Wi-Fi in classrooms, and why?
So there's no doubt they should ban Wi-Fi in the classroom. And now I'm going to explain why. A cell phone is 1.6 watts. I mentioned that. I can measure that strength of that signal by putting a meter inside. If I go into a classroom where it's Wi-Fi enabled, where all the kids are working on their laptop and you have the repeaters and the routers within the room, that signal could be 0.5 watts, about a third of a cell phone. That's constant at 2 to 4 gigahertz typically. I wrote an article 5 years ago, and I called it Guns in the Classroom. Why? For the last 50 years and more, we've generated RF signals to interfere with the enemy. The power levels are much less, but they're used in warfare. And now we have it in the classroom. And it's not 5 watts, 6 hours, 7 hours at a time. I personally believe, and there's some testing evidence that suggests it, that it does influence the kids, and it's not in a positive way.
Should we assume that all cell phones are properly tested for safety before we're allowed to purchase them, and that if there was any risk to the public for wireless radiation, that we would be told?
You're the only one that can decide if you're safe. Certainly, there makes no sense to think others will keep you safe. And so the way industry tells you it's safe is by the manufacturer running their own tests that says we are within the bounds defined by the FCC. It's not an independent study where the manufacturer sends it testing, and it's based on a dummy. They have a simulation. When they do their testing, they go to a dummy, and it's a gelatin that's in it, which looks like basically a human head. And so this dummy, they're looking for thermal impacts and penetration. Do I trust that? No. You can assume it can drift up to 1.9 watts because FCC allows that drift. And in no way can you believe that you are safe, because it seems to me it's slightly loose, the process of ensuring compliance with the FCC.
Why have over 200 scientists called for a moratorium on the rollout of 5G? Why do they think it'll substantially increase exposure to radio frequency radiation that's been proven to be harmful for humans and the environment?
That's sort of the sad part about this. It's sort of the voice. There are so many experts that are in the position of knowledge based on years of experience that talk about the impact, the biological impact of the cell. And they recently, as you're pointing out, went to the FCC and they said, this is not good. You're worried about the thermal, and we know there's a huge preponderance of evidence saying that there's a biological. So it was really a little bit of desperation on the side of the science and research side of the industries to convince the legislation of the services we receive to think about other standards where they need to be. And so if you look at the data, it's indisputable, and that's what they're saying. It's indisputable that we know for sure by looking at all the data that's been developed by well-crafted studies, by experts knowing how to operate those studies, by peer review, meaning others have said, is it make sense or not? There's so many of them that it's hard to believe that it's not sufficient to, at the very least, have a review of the standards. That hasn't happened. By the way, World Health Organization, let me tell you a little bit about that and the standards. They call RF to be carcinogenic. To be carcinogenic says it's possible that it is a cancer-causing element in our environment. the draft of their conclusion actually showed it as 2A. It's a probable carcinogenic. But let's talk about 2B. What does that mean? Arsenic is a 2B carcinogenic. If you're welding and the exhaust from the welder comes up, that's considered a 2B carcinogenic. Petroleum products that have gas off, volatile organic compounds from the gases themselves, which are volatile organic compounds, that is a 2B carcinogenic. So think about it this way. You go into the classroom, you're the parent, and you have your child next to you, and I'm telling you how we're going to conduct our business over the year, and I tell you that we have Wi-Fi for everyone here. Oh no, by the way, we also have welding going on in the room. And when we don't have the welding going on, we have open gas cans generating emissions. So hopefully that's okay with you because it's a 2B carcinogenic. As a parent, what would you think? It's a 2B carcinogenic. Any one of those are carcinogenic. And yet, we think it's acceptable that Wi-Fi is in a classroom. And the reason was why it was 2B, they didn't have enough statistical significant data. So NTP, we spoke about that before, Ramazani study, they are statistically significant. So many of the members that had decided it's 2B have already claimed it's 2A to the public. So it's just the fact that who hasn't met recently to change that rating, that classification.
What is a smart meter and how can we protect ourselves from it?
That's one of those things that people panic about. So let's talk a little bit about that. You have a garage. Your meter, your power is on the side of your garage, and you have two-car garage between you and the kitchen in your home, and then you have your living room, and you have 3 bedrooms. Is that a problem? Is a smart meter that's transmitting roughly in the cell phone range, periodically pinging every 15 minutes? Is that a danger to you and your family? Absolutely not. Why? Distance. Because of the fact that it's far away like that, it presents no danger whatsoever to your family because it's transmitting, yes, but it's not close enough to influence your family. If it was on your wall outside your bedroom and your head was right on the wall, move your bed because now it's serious. Now you're near a pinging transmitter that can influence all night your sleep. So it really depends on where it is and how much of a danger it is based on where it is in your house.
Do cell phone companies put a warning label on cell phones?
When I spoke about Berkeley before, they don't. They've never been obligated to. When Berkeley brought to court the need to label, like they do cigarettes, they found they lost in court. CTI lost in court. And they actually, like the Italy thing, they went 3 times. The first and appealed, second and another appeal. They lost. And so that is, again, one of those instances where there's a groundswell of normal users of these products saying, no, we got to put a stand here, and at the very least we got to tell people who use the cell phone that there may be risk. That's all they wanted to do. And fortunately, they were able to do that. That has not occurred beyond that, but I sort of look at it as the first example of many that are to come.
Is it accurate that insurance companies have refused to cover mobile operators for years now because of the risk being so high? And can you explain that in more detail?
Yeah, I absolutely can. The reality of it is you can't get insurance. They self-insure, have done it for 50 years around liability. Their services potentially expose them to liability. Insurance companies, they look at statistics. They're pretty exacting in their science in support of being a carrier for those services. They've concluded that they're more at risk than they like to be because there's a preponderance of evidence. So if you run a service provider company, you can't get insurance.
What are the health concerns from driving an electric car? Does the battery in the electric car expose you to high EMFs?
Electric cars in general are sort of fairly safe, which is counterintuitive, right? You think that there's all these electronic components, all of them generate emissions, and that's endangering the driver and the passengers more so than typical. But it turns out the energy emitted is because of the windings in the wheel wells. Those are fairly distant from where you sit. If you have a battery and it's right under where you sit, there's no doubt, we know, that there is a DC power emission because there's a current flow. When those batteries are not in the passenger space, I got to tell you, it's fairly safe. So you got to look for how it's constructed, but by and large, in general, they're not too bad. No more than a regular car. So you can make that choice to move there fairly safely.
What impact does wireless radiation and 5G have on animals, insects, and the environment? Do I need to care about this? Does it have an impact on me in that way?
There's no doubt about it. You should be concerned. There was a study several years ago where they put cell phone transmitters in beehives. They never returned. So we know that the bees at 4G and lower were influenced in some way. The mechanics may be in dispute, but certainly they're navigational, and because they tend to rely on senses more so than humans, those things were disrupted, and it clearly had an impact. I have an image that I use often where there was a cell tower, a 5G cell tower, a small cell, and on the bottom were dead bees. It turns out when you go up to 20 gigahertz, which this tower was, the bee itself absorbs 5 times more of the signal than at 4G. So this is anecdotal. We don't have enough evidence to know the long-term impact, but certainly we do have some instances we can point to where the natural environment, the animals within, are being impacted. And you may have heard that there are birds, they claim, in England that died as a result of a trial that was going on. That may be true. It's hard to point to that as clear evidence. It's anecdotal at best, but it's a data point. Keep your eyes open. It may be more.
Can you sum up everything we've talked about in 15 seconds?
Yes. You own your environment. Your kids don't listen to you. Your parents don't listen to you. Your grandchildren don't listen to you. But guess what? You're the architect of your own destiny. You can decide the environment you live in. You can bring safety if you know the rules. And you own the responsibility to make those choices, no one else. So we know our environment evolves. We always have new toxins in the environment that impact the human being. But if you know where they are, you help improve your safety by making sure you architect that plan for safety.
What's the one thing I must do today?
Make sure your kids are safe. Because as I mentioned very early on, I'm an old guy, you're a medium old guy. It's the kids we worry about. And so if you have a sense of urgency, it should be around your kids. We are exposing our children at the various earliest of ages using these technologies that, from most of the evidence, could be fairly serious and long-term to their health. So really pay attention.
Why did you feel it was important for you to come here and speak at the Real Truth About Health conference?
One of the, and such an important value that this conference provides is a sort of a status report on health. And to be able to participate and educate so you can make informed decisions are very, very important. And I appreciated an opportunity to come here to educate the stuff you should know and how it influences you and your family. And this conference is designed to bring the latest and best understanding of the environment we live in today. So you do wonderful work.
How can people best reach you and learn more about your work?
The way they can be reached is defendershield.com is the website we have. And we have a lot of time spent on education. We have a learning section. We keep current. I have a description within that is pages upon pages of what 5G is about. You want to learn a little bit more about 5G? You go to our learning section and you'll learn. If you want to know what's going on currently, we post almost every day the latest in the research and study work, so you can learn more from that by paying attention to our Facebook postings and our blog postings. And we try to keep as current as possible. So if you want to get in contact with us, defendershield.com.